Colorado Territory, 1879. A woman steps from a weather-beaten stagecoach into the harsh glare of the midday sun. Her gloved fingers clutch a worn letter bearing unfamiliar handwriting and a crude map. Her weary eyes scan the desolate collection of buildings, searching for the man whose promises had brought her 1,800 miles from Boston. But fate has other designs, and what awaits her will test not only her resolve, but reveal that true strength often emerges when all familiar comforts have vanished. This is a tale of resilience, unexpected connections, and finding home in the most unlikely circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless July sun bore down on Silverton Pass as the twice-monthly stagecoach from Denver clattered to a stop outside what could generously be called a town square. Dust swirled around the coach wheels, momentarily obscuring the faded wooden sign proclaiming, "Welcome to Silverton Pass, population 178. Though anyone standing in the single dirt road that constituted Main Street could tell that number was wildly optimistic. Eleanor Shaw pressed a handkerchief to her lips, trying to filter the dust that seemed determined to coat her throat. 25 years old, with auburn hair neatly pinned beneath a modest traveling hat and eyes the color of mountain sage, she straightened her spine despite the exhaustion of 12 days' grueling travel. The journey from Boston had been an education in discomfort, endless jolting over rutted roads, nights spent in way stations of dubious cleanliness, and the constant, gnawing anxiety about what awaited at her destination. "Silverton Pass," announced the driver, a man of few words named Cooper, who had maintained almost complete silence for the final day's journey. "End of the line for you, miss." Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles from her traveling dress, a practical grey wool that had once been appropriate in Boston drawing rooms, but now seemed absurdly formal against the backdrop of this raw frontier outpost. Inside her leather satchel lay her most precious possessions, her late mother's silver hairbrush, a small Bible with her family history inscribed in the front pages, $200 in carefully saved banknotes, and most importantly, the letters from William Grant that had brought her to this distant place. "Mr. William Grant?" she asked Cooper, scanning the small gathering of curious onlookers. "He was to meet me here today." Cooper spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Grant? Don't know no Grant. Ask at the Mercantile or maybe Sheriff Holbrook. They keep track of who comes and goes." A flicker of unease passed through Eleanor, but she suppressed it firmly. 6 months of correspondence had culminated in her journey across the country to meet William Grant, whose letters had described a promising cattle ranch 10 miles outside of Silverton Pass. His final letter had explicitly stated he would meet her stagecoach on this exact day, with the understanding that she would become his wife by week's end. Her trunk and valise were unloaded from the coach roof, and then Cooper was climbing back to his seat, eager to reach the next settlement before nightfall. Within moments, the stagecoach was rattling away, leaving Eleanor standing alone beside her possessions, in the center of a town that suddenly seemed much smaller and more desolate than she had imagined. "Need help with those bags, ma'am?" A boy of perhaps 13 approached, eyeing her luggage with an entrepreneurial gleam. "Yes, thank you," Eleanor replied, relieved. "Is there somewhere I might wait while my trunk is delivered to the Grant Ranch? I expect Mr. Grant will arrive shortly." She reached into her purse and extracted a coin that brought a broad smile to the boy's freckled face. "Grant Ranch?" The boy's expression clouded with confusion. "Don't know any Grant Ranch hereabouts." Unease blossomed into genuine concern. "Mr. William Grant. He raises cattle about 10 miles north of town, according to his letters." The boy shook his head. "Only cattle operation north of here belongs to old Harrison, and he died last winter. Place got hit bad in the spring storms. too. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. There must be some mistake. I've been corresponding with Mr. Grant for half a year. He described his property in great detail. You might want to talk to Sheriff Holbrook, the boy suggested, already lifting her smaller bag. He knows everybody for 30 miles around. The sheriff's office occupied a small but solid building at the far end of the street. Inside, Sheriff Thomas Holbrook, a man with graying temples and watchful eyes, looked up from his desk as Eleanor entered. "Something I can help you with, ma'am?" he asked, rising to his feet. "I hope so, Sheriff. I'm looking for William Grant. I was to meet him today upon my arrival." Eleanor fought to keep her voice steady. The sheriff's expression shifted subtly. "And you are?" "Eleanor Shaw. Mr. Grant and I have been corresponding for 6 months." She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "I've come from Boston to be his wife." Holbrook removed his hat, a gesture that immediately confirmed her growing fears. "Miss Shaw, I'm afraid there's no William Grant in Silverton Pass or anywhere in the county. Not now, and not in the 7 years I've served as sheriff." The words struck Eleanor with physical force. "That's impossible. I have his letters right here." She opened her satchel with trembling fingers, withdrawing a packet of 11 letters, each bearing the same careful handwriting. "William Grant, North Star Ranch, Silverton Pass, Colorado Territory." Holbrook examined the envelopes, his frown deepening. "The handwriting is educated, I'll give you that. But I'm sorry to say you've been deceived, ma'am." "But why would anyone?" Eleanor couldn't complete the question. The sheriff sighed, returning the letters. "It happens more than folks talk about. Some men write to Eastern women, spinning tales about prosperous ranches and comfortable lives. They collect whatever money the women send for travel expenses, sometimes keep up the correspondence long enough to request funds for wedding preparations, then disappear." Eleanor sank into a chair, her mind racing. She had been cautious, or so she'd thought. She had insisted on corresponding for 3 months before agreeing to travel west. Grant's letters had been detailed, consistent, and seemingly sincere. He had never directly asked for money, though she had sent a modest sum to cover wedding preparations 2 months ago. "Was there a Harrison ranch that you mentioned?" she asked finally. "Yes, ma'am. Nathan Harrison's place, about 10 miles north. Good spread once. He died in January. Pneumonia took him. Place was hit by a bad storm in April. Lightning struck the main house, burned it pretty bad, I hear. Land's in probate now, waiting on some cousin from St. Louis." "I see." Eleanor's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Miss Shaw, the mountain. View Inn has clean rooms at reasonable rates. I'd suggest you take a day or two to consider your options before the next eastbound stage on Thursday." The implication was clear. Return to Boston, admit defeat, accept that she had been duped by a confidence man who had preyed on her vulnerability. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll consider it." Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, painting Silverton Pass in golden light that couldn't disguise its harshness. The town consisted of a general store, the small inn, 2 saloons, a livery stable, a church, and a scattering of wooden buildings serving as homes and businesses. Nothing like Boston with its cobblestone streets and gaslit neighborhoods. Eleanor made her way to the Mountain View Inn, securing a room and the storage of her trunk. $3, a significant portion of her remaining funds, purchased a small but clean chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the town's main street. Once alone, she finally allowed herself to absorb the magnitude of her situation. William Grant didn't exist. The ranch he had described in such loving detail was fictional. The 6 months of correspondence, the plans, the hopes, all built on falsehood. Half of her savings were spent on the journey west, and now she was stranded in a frontier town where she knew no one. She unfolded Grant's final letter, reading it again by the fading light. My dearest Eleanor, as I write this, spring has finally come to North Star Ranch. The meadows are lush with new grass, and the calves born last month have begun to find their legs. I've completed the improvements to the main house, including the bookshelves in the parlor I promised you. Your bedroom faces east, as you requested, to catch the morning light you so cherish. I count the days until July 15th, when I will finally meet you at the stagecoach. Look for a man in a black hat with a silver band. I'll be the one with the most anticipation in his eyes, as I'll finally be welcoming home the woman whose letters have brought such joy to my solitary life. Until then, I remain faithfully yours, William. The details were so specific, so seemingly heartfelt. How could someone fabricate such sincerity? And more practically, what was she to do now? Return to Boston was the obvious answer, but the thought filled her with dread. She had sold most of her possessions, resigned from her position as a schoolteacher, and departed with no intention of returning. Boston held nothing but painful memories of her parents' deaths from influenza 2 years prior, and the relentless pressure from her father's business associate, Howard Mercer, who had made it clear that marrying him was her only path to security. What Howard didn't know, what no one knew, was that Eleanor's father had secretly left her a small but significant inheritance before his death. The money that Howard assumed would come to him through marriage was legally Eleanor's, though accessing it would require returning to Boston and confronting the man she had deliberately fled. "I won't have him forcing your hand through financial necessity," her father had whispered from his deathbed. "This gives you freedom to choose." Eleanor had chosen freedom in the West, a fresh start with a man who seemed to value her mind as well as her potential as a wife. Now that dream had evaporated like morning mist. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was the innkeeper's wife, a thin woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Martha Collins. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Thought you might like some supper, Miss Shaw. We serve meals downstairs, but I figured you might prefer privacy after your long journey." "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." Eleanor accepted the tray of simple but appetizing food: beef stew, cornbread, and a slice of apple pie. Martha lingered in the doorway. "Sheriff Holbrook mentioned your situation. I'm real sorry about that. Some men ain't got the decency God gave a snake." "It seems not." Eleanor managed a small smile. "If you're thinking of heading back east, stage fare's $20 to Denver. Then there's the train from there. $20, nearly half of what remained of her traveling funds. And if I weren't heading east?" Eleanor asked carefully. Martha considered this. "Well, Silverton Pass is growing. We get the cattle trade from the north, miners coming through from the mountains. Town needs all sorts of services. Seamstress maybe, or if you've got learning." "I was a school teacher in Boston," Eleanor offered. Her father had insisted she obtain an education, unusual as that was for a woman. "Now that's something. Town's been trying to start a proper school. Right now, Reverend Miller teaches the children when he can, but he's got his hands full with 3 parishes. You might speak with him or with Mrs. Abernathy at the general store. She heads the town council." After Martha left, Eleanor ate mechanically, her mind racing with possibilities. She had planned to keep her remaining funds secret, in part to ensure William Grant wanted her for herself, not her modest savings. Now that deception seemed providential rather than unnecessary. If she stayed, she could potentially establish herself as Silverton Pass's schoolteacher. But where would she live? How long before her remaining funds were exhausted? And what of the mysterious Harrison property that William Grant had described, as if it were his own? Eleanor stepped to the window, gazing out at Silverton Pass as darkness fell. Lanterns were being lit along the main street, casting pools of amber light. The town was smaller than she had imagined, rougher, but there was something appealing in its straightforward nature. No pretense, no complex social rules to navigate. A decision began to form. She would visit the burned Harrison Ranch tomorrow. She would see for herself the land that William Grant had described as if it were his own. Perhaps there, among the ashes of one false future, she might find the seeds of a real one. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of purpose. After a breakfast of eggs and coffee in the inn's small dining room, Eleanor inquired about transportation to the Harrison property. The livery stable owner, a man of few words named Dawson, agreed to drive her himself for $2, a significant expense, but necessary for what she needed to discover. "Not much to see out there," he warned as they set off. "Just a burned-out shell and some outbuildings that survived the fire." "Nevertheless, I'd like to see it," Eleanor replied firmly. The journey took nearly an hour, following a rough track that wound through pine-covered hills and open meadows, carpeted with wildflowers. Despite her circumstances, Eleanor found herself captivated by the landscape's wild beauty. So different from Boston's ordered gardens and crowded streets, they crested a small rise, and Dawson pointed ahead. Harrison's place. A cluster of buildings came into view in a small valley beside a creek lined with aspen trees, or rather, what remained of buildings. The main house was a blackened skeleton, its stone chimney standing like a lonely sentinel among charred timbers. A large barn stood nearby, its structure intact, though the roof showed damage on one side. A smaller cabin, perhaps for ranch hands, appeared untouched, as did several corrals and what looked like a workshop. "You can let me out here," Eleanor said as they approached. "Would it be possible for you to return in 2 hours?" Dawson looked doubtful. "Not much to look at for 2 hours, ma'am, and them burned timbers ain't exactly safe." "I'll be careful. I just need some time to—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain her need to connect with this place that had featured so prominently in Grant's fabricated life. Dawson shrugged. "Your $2. I'll be back at noon." Once alone, Eleanor approached the ruins of the main house cautiously. The scent of charred wood still hung in the air, though the fire had happened months ago. She could see where the front door had been, now just an opening in the blackened framework. Stone steps led up to it, remarkably intact. Standing on those steps, looking through the doorway at the burned interior, Eleanor felt a strange connection to this place. William Grant had described a home that had never been his, yet in her mind, she had already lived here. She had imagined arranging books on shelves in the parlor, had pictured herself waking to sunrise through eastern windows. Turning away from the ruin, she explored the remaining structures. The barn, despite its damaged roof, was solidly built with stalls for at least 20 horses and a hayloft above. The smaller cabin was simple but sound. A single room with a stone fireplace, plank floors, and 2 windows. It had obviously been uninhabited since Harrison's death. Dust covered every surface, and a family of mice had taken up residence in a corner. The workshop turned out to be a blacksmith's forge, equipped with an anvil, hammers, and other tools of the trade. Nathan Harrison had apparently done his own ironwork, a valuable skill in a place where the nearest town was 10 miles away. As Eleanor completed her circuit of the property, a sense of possibility began to grow. The land itself was beautiful. A creek provided water, meadows offered grazing, and the surrounding pine forest promised shelter from winter winds. Even the burned house, with its solid stone foundation and chimney, could potentially be rebuilt. Sitting on a fallen log near the creek, Eleanor made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She would not return to Boston. She would not admit defeat. Instead, she would find a way to claim this place for herself. The practical challenges were enormous. A woman alone in the Colorado Territory, attempting to establish a homestead. It was unconventional at best, dangerously foolhardy at worst, but the alternative, returning east to face Howard Mercer's smug satisfaction, was unthinkable. Eleanor was still sitting by the creek, mentally calculating costs and planning initial steps when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Expecting Dawson returning early, she was surprised to see a different rider coming down the track, a tall figure on a chestnut horse, moving with the easy grace of someone completely at home in the saddle. As the rider drew closer, Eleanor rose to her feet, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. She was alone, 10 miles from town, with a stranger approaching. Her hand moved to her satchel, where she carried a small Derringer pistol, a parting gift from her father, who had insisted. She learned to use it before his death. The rider stopped 30 feet away, dismounting in a fluid motion. It was a man, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, with a weathered face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, dark trousers tucked into worn boots, and a battered leather vest. A red bandana was knotted around his neck, and his hands, though clean, showed the calluses of hard labor. Most striking was his silence. He made no greeting, simply stood beside his horse, observing her with an intensity that was neither threatening nor welcoming, merely assessing. "Hello," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm Eleanor Shaw. I arrived in Silverton. Pass yesterday." The man touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but offered no verbal response. The silence stretched between them until Eleanor felt compelled to continue. "I realize I may be trespassing. I was told this property belonged to a Mr. Harrison, who passed away recently." The man nodded once, then reached inside his vest and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He crossed the distance between them with unhurried steps and handed her the paper. It was a crudely printed notice: "Caretaker, Harrison Ranch, James Taylor, authorized by N. Harrison Estate." "You're the caretaker," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "Mr. Taylor," another nod, but still no words. His eyes, a deep blue that reminded her of mountain lakes, studied her with open curiosity. "I came to see this property because—" She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I was corresponding with someone who described this place as if it were his. I traveled from Boston expecting to meet him, only to discover he doesn't exist, and this property was never his to offer." Something flickered in Taylor's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. He gestured toward the burned house, then back to her, his head tilted in question. "Yes, this is where I was supposed to live." Eleanor was surprised at how easily she understood his unspoken query. As his wife, Taylor's weathered face showed a momentary softening before he turned and gestured for her to follow him. He led her to the small cabin, unlocking the door and stepping back so she could enter first. Inside, though dusty, the cabin was more promising than it had appeared from outside. The fireplace was well built, the roof seemed sound, and the single room was spacious enough for basic furnishings. Taylor moved to a crude shelf and picked up a slate and chalk, the kind used in schoolrooms. He wrote quickly and handed it to her. "Can speak, choose not to. War." Eleanor nodded, understanding immediately. She had taught veterans' children in Boston, had seen the effects of the war between the states on returning soldiers. Some wounds weren't visible. "Thank you for showing me the cabin," she said, handing back the slate. "It's much nicer than I expected." He wrote again, "Yours if wanted, $5 a month. Work needed." The unexpected offer caught Eleanor off guard. "You're offering to rent me the cabin? Is that within your authority as caretaker?" Taylor nodded, writing, "Harrison letter, maintain property, generate income until probate. What happens when the cousin from St. Louis arrives to claim his inheritance?" Taylor's expression turned grim as he wrote, "Cousin gambling debts. Won't come. Sell sight unseen." This new information changed everything. If the heir had no interest in claiming the property personally, there might be an opportunity Eleanor hadn't considered. "Mr. Taylor, would it be possible for me to rent the cabin while I consider my options? I find myself in need of accommodations, and returning east isn't an option I wish to pursue." Taylor studied her for a long moment, then wrote, "Dangerous. Woman alone, 10 miles from town. I appreciate your concern, but I'm more capable than I appear." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I'm willing to pay a fair rent, and I could help maintain the property while I'm here." Taylor seemed to consider this, his expression unreadable. Finally, he wrote, "Cabin needs work. Roof leaks. Chimney smokes. I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Taylor." Something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes as he wrote, $5 monthly, includes well water, garden, tools in barn off limits without permission. Same for forge. That seems fair." It was more than fair, it was generous. "Check property. Every few days. Won't enter the cabin without invitation." Eleanor extended her hand. "We have an agreement, Mr. Taylor." After a moment's hesitation, he shook it, his large hand engulfing her smaller one. His palm was calloused, his grip firm, but careful. Taylor gestured toward his horse, then to her, raising an eyebrow in question. "Yes, I need transportation back to town to collect my belongings. The livery owner was going to return it for me, but if you're offering—" He nodded once, then led the way outside to his horse, a well-kept chestnut gelding with intelligent eyes. With surprising gentleness, he helped Eleanor mount, then swung up behind her, maintaining a respectful distance as they rode toward Silverton Pass. As they rode away from the Harrison property, Eleanor looked back at the burned house, silhouetted against the Colorado sky. William Grant's deception had led her to this moment, stranded in the wilderness, about to embark on a life so different from anything she had known that she could barely imagine its contours. Yet, as the property disappeared from view, Eleanor felt something unexpected. Not despair, not regret, but a curious sense of anticipation. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet fully comprehend. But it was her path, chosen freely, leading away from Boston's constraints toward a future limited only by her own courage and determination. And though the silent man riding behind her remained a mystery, his unexpected offer of shelter had provided the first stepping stone on that path, a foundation, however tenuous, upon which she might build something new from the ashes of deception. 3 days after moving into the cabin at the former Harrison Ranch, Eleanor Shaw awoke to water dripping steadily onto her forehead. The roof leaks Taylor had mentioned made themselves known during the night's sudden rainstorm, and now her bedding was soaked through. "Wonderful," she muttered, climbing from the narrow cot and positioning her wash basin to catch the worst of the drips. The cabin, which had seemed full of potential by daylight, revealed its true character in the rain, drafty, damp, and decidedly unwelcoming. The fireplace had indeed smoked terribly when she'd attempted to cook the previous evening, forcing her to make do with cold biscuits and jerky purchased from Mrs. Abernathy's general store. Eleanor changed into her work dress, one of only 3 dresses she'd brought west, and laced up her sturdy boots. The rain had slowed to a drizzle as she stepped outside to assess the damage. The cabin roof's cedar shingles had rotted in several places, creating the leaks that had disturbed her sleep. Repairing it would require materials she didn't have, and skills she had yet to acquire. A sound from the direction of the barn caught her attention. Someone was moving around inside, Taylor most likely, checking on the property as promised. Eleanor hesitated, reluctant to appear helpless after her confident assertions of capability, but practicality won out. She needed information, if not assistance. James Taylor was examining the barn's damaged roof section when she entered, his back to her, as he made notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. He moved with surprising grace for such a tall man, balancing effortlessly on a ladder as he inspected the roof beams. "Mr. Taylor," she called, not wanting to startle him. He turned, tucking the notebook into his vest pocket. His deep blue eyes took in her damp hair and mud-spattered dress immediately, understanding the situation without words. He reached for his slate. Roof leaks worse than mentioned. Yes, Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. I need to purchase repair materials. Could you recommend where I might acquire shingles and whatever else is necessary? Taylor descended the ladder, moving with the deliberate care of a man accustomed to working alone. He wrote again, "Sawmill 7 miles south can take you after rain stops. Thank you, but I wouldn't want to impose on your time. Perhaps you could simply provide directions." His expression remained neutral as he wrote, "Roads muddy, dangerous alone. We'll take you tomorrow." Eleanor recognized that arguing would be futile. "Very well, I appreciate your assistance." Taylor nodded once, then gestured toward the main house ruins, raising an eyebrow in question. "Yes, I've explored a bit," Eleanor said, correctly interpreting his query. "The foundation seems solid, the stone chimney as well. Is rebuilding possible, do you think?" Taylor considered this, then wrote, "Possible. Expensive. Winter comes early here." The implication was clear. Any significant rebuilding would need to wait until spring. For now, making the cabin habitable was the priority. "Coffee at cabin?" he wrote, the question surprising her. "I'm afraid the fireplace smoked so badly I couldn't heat water this morning." Taylor nodded knowingly and gestured for her to follow him. He led her to a section of the workshop that she hadn't properly explored. Inside was a small cast-iron stove, clearly used for heating the space during metalworking. With efficient movements, he lit kindling and added small pieces of split wood. Within minutes, the stove was radiating heat. From a shelf, he retrieved a battered coffee pot, filled it from a water bucket, and placed it on the stove. Then he reached into a canvas sack hanging from a nail and measured coffee grounds into the pot. The simple domesticity of the scene struck Eleanor forcefully. This silent man, who chose not to speak, communicated more through actions than most people did with endless words. The care with which he prepared coffee for an unexpected guest spoke of ingrained courtesy that had nothing to do with social convention and everything to do with basic human kindness. "Thank you," she said when he handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "I didn't expect such hospitality." Taylor shrugged slightly, as if to suggest it was nothing worth mentioning. He sipped his own coffee, leaning against the workbench, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window, where rain continued to fall in a steady patter. "Have you been a caretaker here for a long?" Eleanor asked, seeking to understand more about the man who would be her closest neighbor. He set down his cup to write, "Since Harrison died. January. Was foreman before. And you worked the forge as well?" Taylor nodded, gesturing toward various tools hanging on the walls, clearly custom-made pieces, crafted with skill and purpose. "They're beautiful," Eleanor said, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship. "Did you learn blacksmithing before or after the war?" A shadow crossed his face at the mention of the war, but he answered, "Apprenticed at 16. Army needed smiths." The brief exchange told her much. He'd been young when the war began, had served as a blacksmith rather than a combat soldier, yet something during that service had led to his silence. Eleanor didn't press further, respecting boundaries that were clearly important to him. "I should let you return to your work," she said, finishing her coffee. "Thank you again for your kindness." Taylor wrote, "Meet tomorrow, 8 o'clock, for shingles." Eleanor nodded and stepped out into the drizzle, making her way back to the cabin. Inside, despite the leaks and dampness, she felt a strange sense of accomplishment. She'd traveled west, discovered deception, and instead of fleeing back to the safety of Boston, had chosen a path that would test every aspect of her character and capability. The remainder of the day was spent organizing her meager possessions and making the cabin as habitable as possible. She swept years of dust from the floor, cleared cobwebs from corners, and scrubbed the single window until it admitted considerably more light. With a determined effort, she managed to move the cot away from the worst of the roof leaks. As darkness fell, she lit the single lamp she'd purchased in town and opened her journal, recording the day's events and her reflections. The act of writing clarified her thoughts and strengthened her resolve. She would learn what she needed to know, acquire the necessary skills, and create a life here. Not the life William Grant had falsely promised, but something genuinely her own. Morning brought clearing skies, and James Taylor arriving precisely at 8 o'clock, driving a wagon pulled by two sturdy workhorses. He helped Eleanor up to the seat with a courteous gesture, then set the horses in motion toward the sawmill. The journey gave Eleanor her first real view of the surrounding countryside. The Harrison property sat in a sheltered valley, surrounded by rolling hills, that gave way to distant mountains still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Meadows, bursting with wildflowers, alternated with stands of pine and aspen, creating a landscape of startling beauty. "It's magnificent," she said, the words escaping unbidden. Taylor nodded, his expression softening slightly as he surveyed the land he clearly knew intimately. He stopped the wagon briefly at a high point on the road, allowing her to take in the panoramic view. From this vantage, she could see not only the Harrison property with its burned main house and cluster of outbuildings, but also several distant homesteads and ranches scattered across the valley. Columns of smoke rose from chimneys, the only sign of human habitation in an otherwise wild landscape. The sawmill occupied a clearing beside a swift-flowing stream that provided power for its operations. The owner, a barrel-chested man named Whitaker, greeted Taylor with a hearty handshake and a stream of one-sided conversation, apparently accustomed to the younger man's silence. "Taylor, good to see you. Need timbers for the Harrison place, I expect? Terrible about that fire. Nathan was a good man." He turned curious eyes to Eleanor. "And who might this be?" "Eleanor Shaw," she introduced herself. "I'm renting the cabin at the Harrison property." Whitaker's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "Are you indeed all by yourself?" "For the time being," Eleanor replied, with a polite but firm smile that discouraged further questions. Taylor handed Whitaker a list of materials, and the mill owner nodded as he read through it. "Roof repairs, I see. Smart to get that done before. Fall. Got most of this on hand. Cedar shingles just came in last week. Good timing for you. Let me get the boys to load your wagon." As Whitaker shouted orders to his workers, he continued speaking to Eleanor. "Not many women would take on a remote cabin alone, Miss Shaw. You must be made of stern stuff." "Necessity often reveals capabilities we didn't know we possessed," Eleanor replied. Whitaker chuckled. "Well said. You're in good hands with Taylor. Here, best ranch foreman in the territory, and a fair smith to boot. Nathan Harrison thought the world of him." This unsolicited endorsement confirmed Eleanor's growing impression of her silent neighbor. The respect Whitaker showed suggested Taylor was well regarded throughout the area, despite, or perhaps because of, his quiet nature. The wagon loaded with shingles, timbers, nails, and other supplies, they began the return journey to the Harrison property. Eleanor found herself studying Taylor's profile as he handled the team with unconscious skill. His face, weathered by sun and wind, revealed little of his thoughts, yet there was a calmness to his presence that she found oddly reassuring. The cost of the materials had been significant, nearly $15 from her dwindling funds. But the investment was necessary if she intended to remain through the coming winter, a prospect that grew more determined with each passing day. Back at the ranch, Taylor didn't simply deliver the materials and leave, as Eleanor half expected. Instead, he unloaded everything neatly beside the cabin, then went to the barn and returned with tools, a hammer, saw, measuring stick, and other implements she didn't recognize. He wrote on his slate, "Show you how," You learn quick. The offer surprised her. You'd teach me to repair the roof? Need 2 people, can't do alone. He sketched a quick diagram showing how one person needed to hold shingles in place while another nailed them down. Then we'll work together, Eleanor decided. But I insist on providing lunch afterward. It's the least I can do for your assistance. Taylor nodded once in agreement. What followed was Eleanor's first true lesson in frontier survival. Taylor proved to be a patient teacher, demonstrating each step of the roof repair process, then watching carefully as she attempted to duplicate his actions. He corrected her technique with gentle gestures rather than written criticism, guiding her hands to show the proper angle for nailing shingles or the correct way to measure overlap. By midday, they had replaced the worst section of the cabin roof. Eleanor's arms ached from unaccustomed labor, and her fingers were sore from occasional misplaced hammer strikes, but the satisfaction of tangible achievement far outweighed the discomfort. I believe I promised lunch, she said, climbing down from the ladder, though I should warn you, my cooking skills are limited to what a Boston school teacher might prepare. Taylor's expression showed a hint of amusement as he wrote, hungry enough not to mind. From her supplies, Eleanor assembled a simple meal of bread, dried beef and apples, humble fare, but the best she could manage without proper cooking facilities. They sat on the cabin's small porch, eating in companionable silence as the afternoon sun warmed the valley. Were you born in Colorado territory? Eleanor asked eventually, curious about the man who had so unexpectedly become part of her new life. Taylor shook his head, writing, Pennsylvania. Came west after war, 1866. What brought you here specifically? Space. Silence. Mountains don't ask questions. The blunt honesty of his response touched her. How many returning soldiers had sought similar solace in the Western Territories, fleeing the crowded East with its painful reminders and expectations? And you found what you were looking for? She asked softly. Taylor gazed toward the distant mountains, considering. Finally, he wrote, mostly found purpose, respect, peace sometimes. It was perhaps the most personal revelation he had offered, and Eleanor valued it accordingly. Thank you for sharing that with me. He nodded, then stood and gathered the tools, clearly indicating the break was over. The remainder of the afternoon was spent completing the roof repairs. By sunset, the cabin was weather-tight, a significant improvement that would make habitation much more comfortable. As Taylor prepared to leave, Eleanor impulsively asked, could you recommend books about this region? About ranching, gardening, basic construction, anything that might help me learn what I need to know. The question seemed to please him. He wrote quickly, have books. We'll bring tomorrow. Show you garden too. I'd appreciate that very much. After he'd gone, Eleanor stood outside the cabin, watching darkness gather over the valley. The day's labor had exhausted her physically, but mentally she felt more alert and engaged than she had in months. Each skill acquired, each task completed successfully, built her confidence and strengthened her commitment to making this unlikely place her home. Inside the now weather-tight cabin, she lit her lamp and began a list of priorities. Clean the chimney. To eliminate the smoking problem, whitewash the interior walls, construct some basic furniture beyond the cot and single chair, plant a kitchen garden before it was too late in the season, learn to use the well properly, find a way to generate income. The challenges were substantial, but for the first time since discovering William Grant's deception, they felt surmountable. She had resources, limited funds, her education, her determination, and now, unexpectedly, a taciturn neighbor willing to share his knowledge. True to his word, Taylor arrived the next morning with a small collection of books, a manual on basic carpentry, a guide to Rocky Mountain flora and fauna, a farmer's almanac specific to the Colorado Territory, and most surprisingly, a volume of Thoreau's Walden. Thoreau? Eleanor asked, unable to hide her surprise at the philosophical work among the practical manuals. Taylor's expression was almost sheepish as he wrote, "Speaks to solitude, makes it meaningful." The simple explanation revealed more about him than any conventional biography might have done. This man who chose silence found meaning in Thoreau's deliberate solitude, his rejection of society's empty conversations in favor of deeper connection with the essential aspects of life. "Thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of his selections. "I'll care for them well." He nodded, then gestured toward the overgrown area behind the cabin that had once been a kitchen garden. Eleanor followed him, notebook in hand, ready to learn yet another crucial skill for frontier survival. The garden, though neglected for months, showed signs of resilient life beneath the weeds. Taylor knelt and carefully uncovered wild onions, a struggling patch of carrots and hardy herbs that had survived without human attention. With his slate, he identified each plant, explaining through simple drawings and words which could be harvested now and which needed more time. From his pocket, he produced several paper packets. Seeds, he explained through writing. Not too late to plant quick-growing vegetables that would mature before the first frost, which typically came in early October. Eleanor worked beside him, clearing weeds, turning soil, and planting seeds according to his instructions. The labor was hard, under the summer sun, but deeply satisfying. By midday, they had reclaimed half the garden, a tangible achievement that represented far more than just potential food production. It was another step toward true independence. As days stretched into weeks, Eleanor established a rhythm to her new life. Mornings were devoted to physical labor, continuing improvements to the cabin, tending the garden, learning basic ranch skills under Taylor's patient guidance. Afternoons often found her in the town of Silverton Pass, where she had secured a position teaching children in the church 3 days a week. The income was modest, just $8 monthly, but combined with her dwindling savings, it would sustain her through the coming winter. More importantly, it connected her to the community, transforming her from mysterious outsider to a recognized, if unconventional, member of Silverton Pass society. The townsfolk's reactions to her situation varied widely. Some, like Reverend Miller and Mrs. Abernathy, offered genuine welcome and practical assistance. Others viewed her with suspicion. A single woman living alone 10 miles from town defied social norms in ways that made many uncomfortable. Most problematic were the occasional suitors, unmarried men drawn by the novelty of an educated Eastern woman in their midst. Eleanor deflected their attention politely but firmly, making it clear that her solitary status was by choice rather than necessity. Through it all, James Taylor remained a steady presence, never intrusive, yet consistently supportive. Their communication, limited by his self-imposed silence, nonetheless deepened as they worked together on various projects around the Harrison property. Eleanor learned to read meanings in his expressions and gestures that went beyond the words he occasionally wrote on his slate, while he seemed to anticipate her questions and needs with uncanny accuracy. It was Taylor who warned her of winter's approach one crisp September morning, writing, "Need more preparations." First snow 6 weeks away, the warning prompted a flurry of activity, gathering and chopping firewood, reinforcing the cabin's door and window, harvesting and preserving the garden's modest yield, acquiring warmer clothing and additional supplies from Mrs. Abernathy's store. With each task completed, Eleanor's confidence grew. The frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 2 months earlier, betrayed and alone, was transforming into someone stronger and more self-reliant. The cabin, once a desperate temporary shelter, had become genuinely hers through the work of her own hands. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching sunset paint the valley in amber and gold, Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that the deception that had brought her west, painful as it had been, had ultimately given her a precious gift. Freedom not just from Howard Mercer's unwelcome attentions, but from the constrained expectations of her former life. Here, success or failure rested entirely on her own efforts. The challenges were greater, the comforts fewer, but the sense of genuine accomplishment at the end of each day far surpassed anything she had known in Boston. As if summoned by her thoughts, she saw Taylor approaching on horseback, returning from some errand in town. His tall figure, silhouetted against the sunset, embodied the frontier spirit that she was gradually adopting as her own. Self-sufficient, resilient, unbound by society's arbitrary limitations. He dismounted near her porch, removing his hat briefly in greeting. His expression, usually guarded, held something that might have been approval as he surveyed the neatly stacked firewood and the smoke rising properly from the now clean chimney. Eleanor smiled in welcome, recognizing with sudden clarity that this silent man had become more than just a neighbor or teacher of necessary skills. He had become a friend, perhaps the first true friend she had found in this new life she was building from the ashes of deception. October arrived with a dramatic transformation of the valley. Aspen trees that had been deep green just days before now blazed in brilliant gold against the dark pines. Mornings brought frost that melted by midday, and evenings carried a sharp chill that hinted at the winter to come. Eleanor stood at her garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables, stunted carrots, small potatoes, and hardy greens that had survived the early frosts. Not a bountiful crop by any measure, but each plant represented a victory of perseverance over circumstance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. James Taylor rode toward the cabin, leading a second horse, a dappled grey mare, with a white blaze on her forehead. He dismounted with his usual fluid grace and approached, the mare following docilely behind. "Good morning, Mr. Taylor," Eleanor greeted him, wiping soil from her hands. Over the weeks, she had maintained the formality of address, though their working relationship had developed a comfortable familiarity. Taylor nodded in greeting, then gestured to the mare with a questioning look. "She's lovely," Eleanor said. "Is she from the Harrison herd?" He shook his head and reached for his slate. "For you, winter coming. Can't walk to town in snow." Eleanor stared in astonishment, first at the words, then at the mare, then at Taylor's impassive face. "You're giving me a horse?" he clarified quickly. "Harrison horse, part of property, teaching you to ride properly, I see." The distinction was important, not a personal gift, but a practical necessity he was addressing as property caretaker. Still, the thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you. I've ridden before, but only in city parks on very gentle mounts." Taylor's slight smile suggested he'd guessed as much. He wrote, "Daisy is gentle, patient with beginners." "Daisy," Eleanor repeated, approaching the mare carefully. The horse lowered her head, allowing Eleanor to stroke her velvety nose. "She's beautiful. Start lessons today," Taylor wrote. "Yes, I'd like that very much." What followed was an education unlike any Eleanor had received in Boston. Taylor proved a demanding but patient teacher, insisting on proper form and technique. From the beginning, he showed her how to saddle and bridle the horse correctly, how to mount without pulling on the reins, how to signal direction with subtle shifts of weight rather than just the reins. For the first lesson, he led Daisy around the cleared area near the barn, gradually lengthening the lead rope until Eleanor was essentially guiding the horse herself. By the end of 2 hours, she had progressed to riding independently in a small circle, her posture gradually relaxing from rigid nervousness to cautious confidence. "This is nothing like riding in the Boston Public Garden," she admitted as they finished the lesson. There, the horses barely needed guidance. They simply followed the established paths. Taylor nodded, writing, "Here, your life depends on your horse. Must understand each other." The blunt assessment was characteristic of him, no attempt to soften reality with pleasant fictions. In this harsh and beautiful country, a horse wasn't a luxury or a convenience, but often the difference between life and death. "When do you think I'll be ready to ride to town alone?" Eleanor asked. "Few more lessons, practice daily, ready by first snow." "I'll work hard," she promised. "I don't want to be completely isolated when winter comes." Taylor regarded her thoughtfully, then wrote something that surprised her. "Not alone. I'm near." The simple statement, the first time he had directly acknowledged their developing connection, brought unexpected warmth to Eleanor's cheeks. "Yes, you are, and I'm very grateful for that." He ducked his head slightly in acknowledgement, then turned to care for the horses, effectively ending the moment of personal connection. The riding lessons continued daily, with Eleanor practicing whenever her teaching duties and other tasks allowed. Daisy proved as patient as Taylor had promised, tolerating her rider's initial clumsiness with equine stoicism. Within a week, Eleanor was confident enough to ride the full perimeter of the Harrison property, though still nervous about attempting the journey to town alone. On a particularly fine October morning, with the aspen leaves shimmering like gold, coins in the breeze, Taylor appeared with 2 horses saddled and ready. "Ride to Lockhart's property," he wrote. "Show you landmarks. Safer travel." Eleanor welcomed the opportunity to explore beyond the immediate surroundings of the ranch. Together, they rode northward, following a creek that eventually joined the larger stream running through the Harrison land. Taylor pointed out distinctive rock formations, ancient trees, and other natural markers that would help orient her if she became lost. They stopped to rest on a ridge overlooking a broad meadow, where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. Taylor indicated with a gesture that this was the Lockhart property he had mentioned. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, taking in the well-maintained ranch with its sturdy house and outbuildings. "How long have they been established here?" 10 years. Good neighbors. Daniel Lockhart serves as circuit judge when needed. This was more information than Taylor usually volunteered, suggesting the Lockharts held some significance for him. "Perhaps we should pay a visit," Eleanor suggested. "I've been remiss in making proper acquaintance with the neighbors." Taylor hesitated, then wrote, "Sarah Lockhart has been asking about you, curious about Eastern woman living alone." "I imagine everyone within 50 miles has been curious about that," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "I've grown accustomed to being a subject of speculation." They rode down to the Lockhart ranch, where their arrival was announced by the enthusiastic barking of several dogs. A woman emerged from the house, tall, silver-haired, with a face weathered by sun and wind, but still handsome. Her expression brightened visibly when she saw Taylor. "James Taylor, about time you showed your face around here." Her voice was warm with genuine welcome as she approached. Then her gaze shifted to Eleanor, curiosity evident. "And you must be Miss Shaw. We've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Eleanor replied, dismounting carefully as Taylor had taught her. "Interesting things, certainly." Sarah Lockhart's direct gaze was assessing, but not unkind. "It's not every day. A Boston school teacher takes up residence in a cabin that most men would consider barely habitable. Necessity can make us adaptable," Eleanor said simply. "Indeed it can. Come inside, both of you. I've just taken an apple pie from the oven, and I'll put coffee on." Taylor hesitated, but at Sarah's insistent gesture, he followed them into the house. The interior was surprisingly refined for a frontier home. Polished furniture, woven rugs covering the plank floors, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Eleanor realized with a start that this was how the Harrison house might have looked before the fire. Comfortable, civilized, a true home rather than mere shelter. As Sarah busied herself with coffee, Eleanor noticed Taylor glancing repeatedly toward a doorway that presumably led to another room. His normally impassive face showed tension around the eyes. "Daniel's down at the creek with the men, moving the herd to winter pasture," Sarah said, correctly interpreting his concern. "He'll be sorry to have missed you." The slight easing of Taylor's shoulders confirmed Eleanor's growing suspicion that he avoided most social interactions when possible. Over coffee and delicious apple pie, a luxury Eleanor hadn't tasted since leaving Boston, Sarah proved to be a thoughtful hostess and a valuable source of information. Without obvious prying, she shared insights about the area, its seasonal challenges, and its inhabitants that would have taken Eleanor months to discover independently. "Winter comes hard up here," Sarah said, pouring more coffee. "Not just the snow and cold, but the isolation. Most neighbors hunker down from November through March, only venturing out when absolutely necessary. I've been preparing as best I can," Eleanor said. "Mr. Taylor has been generous with advice and practical assistance." Sarah's gaze moved between them, something knowing in her expression. "James has always been one to show his character through actions rather than words, even before the war took his voice." Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face, for Sarah continued, "He hasn't told you?" "No, I suppose he wouldn't." Taylor, who had been listening silently as always, reached for his slate and wrote with unusually forceful strokes, "My choice, not war." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the correction. After, though, it was after. The exchange confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. Taylor's silence was self-imposed rather than the result of physical injury. Before she could reflect further on this revelation, Sarah changed the subject. "You've been teaching at the church. In Silverton Pass, I understand. How are you finding our frontier children?" "Eager to learn, though their education has been inconsistent," Eleanor replied. "Reverend Miller has done his best, but the older children especially need more structured instruction." "That town has needed a proper school for years," Sarah said. "Perhaps you're the catalyst that will finally make it happen." The visit lasted another hour, with Sarah doing most of the talking while Taylor occasionally contributed written comments when directly addressed. As they prepared to leave, Sarah pressed a cloth-wrapped package into Eleanor's hands. "Dried apples and some preserved peaches," she explained. "A little sweetness makes the winter more bearable." "You're very kind," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by the neighborly gesture. Not kindness, practical frontier wisdom. We survive by helping each other. Sarah's gaze was direct. "Remember that when the snow lies deep, Miss Shaw. Pride has no place in a Colorado winter." The ride back to the Harrison property was quieter, both Eleanor and Taylor absorbed in their own thoughts. The visit had provided Eleanor with a new perspective, a glimpse of what established ranch life could be, beyond mere survival. The Lockharts had created genuine civilization in this remote place, proving it was possible to have both independence and comfort, wilderness and refinement. As they approached the cabin, Eleanor finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Lockhart said something about your voice being your choice. I hope you don't think I've been prying." Taylor shook his head, dismissing her concern. After a moment's hesitation, he stopped his horse and reached for his slate. "Lost men under my command, screaming orders no one heard. When war ended found. No words worth saying." The stark explanation, more personal than anything he had previously shared, revealed volumes about the man riding beside her. Not physical injury, but profound psychological trauma had led to his silence. A deliberate withdrawal from verbal communication after experiences too horrible to integrate into normal life. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said simply, offering neither pity nor facile comfort, sensing either would be unwelcome. Taylor nodded once, tucking away his slate, clearly considering the subject closed. The following days brought Eleanor's first experience with high country snow, not a gentle dusting, but a serious storm that left 8 inches of white powder covering everything. The world transformed overnight. familiar landmarks disappearing under the smooth white blanket, trees bending under the weight of snow on their branches. The beauty was breathtaking, sunlight sparkling on untouched snow, the mountains standing in sharp relief against a sky of impossible blue. But the practical challenges were immediate. Simply reaching the well for water became a significant task, requiring Eleanor to break a path through drifts that reached her knees in places. But mid-morning, she was struggling to clear the area immediately around the cabin when Taylor appeared, leading his horse through the snow. He carried a shovel and what looked like snowshoes strapped to his back. Without preamble, he began clearing a proper path from the cabin to the well, working with the efficient strength she had come to expect from him. When that was done, he showed her how to use the snowshoes, awkward at first, but ultimately making movement through deeper snow possible. "Can't teach today," he wrote. "Town road needs clearing. Be back tomorrow." "Thank you for the snowshoes," Eleanor said, still practicing. Her balance in the unfamiliar footwear. "They make an extraordinary difference." Taylor nodded, then added, "Check chimney. Snow can block. Dangerous." The warning proved prescient. That evening, as the temperature dropped sharply, Eleanor noticed the fire smoking more than usual. Remembering Taylor's advice, she carefully investigated and found that snow had indeed partially blocked the chimney top. Clearing it required venturing onto the cabin roof in darkness. A frightening task, but one she managed by moving methodically and focusing on each step rather than the potential fall. The reward was immediate, a properly drawing fire that filled the cabin with welcome warmth through the bitter night. In the morning, the temperature had plummeted further, and Eleanor awoke to frost patterns on the inside of her window. The water bucket had a skim of ice on its surface, and her breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air. Stoking the fire demanded fingers made clumsy by cold, but she persevered, gradually bringing the cabin to a bearable temperature. Outside, the snow had hardened into a crust that supported her weight in some places, but unexpectedly gave way in others, making even simple movement treacherous. Taylor arrived mid-morning, his horse breaking trail through the fresh snow. From his saddlebags, he produced a surprising gift, a pair of knitted wool gloves, far warmer than Eleanor's thin Boston pair. "Sarah Lockhart sent these," he wrote. "Said your hands looked city soft." Eleanor laughed, despite the cold. "She's not." "Wrong. Please thank her for me when you see her next." Taylor studied the cabin with a critical eye, then wrote, "Need banking around foundation. Snow insulates if used properly." Together they spent the morning piling snow against the lower walls of the cabin, creating a barrier against the wind that immediately improved conditions inside. Taylor showed her how to check for spots where heat was escaping unnecessarily, how to adjust the damper in the fireplace for maximum efficiency, and how to keep a supply of wood near enough to the fire to dry thoroughly before burning. These lessons, unglamorous but essential, might well mean the difference between survival and disaster in the months to come. As Taylor prepared to leave, Eleanor asked the question that had been growing in her mind. "This storm, is it typical for October? Or is winter arriving early?" "Early," he confirmed. "Bad sign. Could be hard winter ahead." "I'm glad I have a good teacher," she said, the admission coming easily now that she had abandoned any pretense of complete self-sufficiency. Taylor's expression softened momentarily. He wrote, "You learn well, adapt quickly, will survive." Coming from him, it was high praise indeed. The snow lingered for days, melting only partially before another storm arrived, colder and more severe than the first. Eleanor's riding lessons had to be abandoned temporarily, but Taylor continued to visit almost daily, sometimes bringing supplies from town, other times simply checking that she was managing the challenges of her first frontier winter. Their communication, limited by his chosen silence, nonetheless deepened with each interaction. Eleanor found herself noticing the subtle variations in his expressions, the way his eyes conveyed what his voice did not. For his part, Taylor seemed increasingly attuned to her needs, often anticipating difficulties before she had fully recognized them herself. One evening, as an early November blizzard howled outside, Eleanor sat before her fire reading Thoreau by lamplight. The contrast between her current circumstances and her Boston life struck her forcefully. There, she had been surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone, her true self buried beneath layers of social expectation. Here, despite the physical isolation, she was becoming truly known, at least to one person, in ways that mattered. When Taylor next visited, bringing mail that had been delayed by the storms, Eleanor was struck by a new awareness. This man, who had initially been simply a mysterious caretaker, then a teacher of necessary skills, had gradually become something she hadn't expected to find in this remote place. A friend whose presence she valued beyond practical considerations. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it anchored her more firmly to this new life she was building. Unsettling because it introduced an emotional complexity she hadn't anticipated when fleeing Boston's social constraints. As they worked together, replacing a hinge on the barn door that had broken in the high winds, Eleanor found herself studying Taylor's profile, wondering about the experiences that had shaped him into the solitary, capable man who now occupied such an important place in her life. He must have sensed her attention, for he turned, one eyebrow raised in silent question. "I was just thinking," Eleanor said, slightly embarrassed at being caught staring, "how strange it is that deception brought me here, yet has ultimately led to something genuine." Taylor considered this, then wrote, "Life rarely follows expected paths." The simple observation contained a profound truth that resonated with her own journey from Boston schoolteacher to frontier homesteader. "No," she agreed softly. "The most meaningful paths are often those we never planned to walk." The first week of December brought a cold snap, unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in Boston. For 3 days, the temperature never rose above freezing, even at midday. Water froze solid in the bucket indoors, despite the constant fire, and frost patterns grew so thick on the windows that they blocked much of the light. On the 4th morning, Eleanor awoke to an ominous silence. The wind that had howled continuously for days had stopped, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by occasional creaking as the cabin's timbers contracted in the brutal cold. She kindled the fire with fingers numbed despite her gloves, mentally calculating her remaining firewood supply. At the current rate of consumption, she would exhaust her carefully stacked woodpile by late January, far too early with winter's grip unlikely to loosen before April. The prospect of running out of firewood in this harsh environment was not merely uncomfortable, but potentially fatal. Eleanor pulled on her warmest clothes, wrapped Sarah Lockhart's knitted scarf around her neck, and ventured outside. The scene that greeted her was both breathtaking and forbidding. Snow had drifted against the north side of the cabin nearly to the roof edge. Trees stood encased in ice that sparkled blindingly in the morning sun. The world had been transformed into a crystalline sculpture of extraordinary beauty and deadly intent. Eleanor was struggling to break a path to the woodshed when she spotted a figure on horseback, approaching through the snow. Even at a distance, she recognized Taylor's distinctive posture in the saddle. Relief washed through her, not just at the prospect of assistance with the immediate task, but at the reassurance of human connection in this isolated wilderness. As he drew closer, she saw he was leading a second horse, pulling an improvised sled loaded with firewood. He dismounted with his usual economy of movement, though she noticed a slight stiffness, suggesting the cold affected him too, despite his frontier-hardened constitution. "I'm very glad to see you," Eleanor admitted without preamble. "I was just I'm calculating how quickly I'll run through my woodpile in this weather. Taylor nodded, reaching for his slate. Thought so. Brought extra from Harrison Timber Stand. Thank you. You've saved me from a rather desperate situation. Eleanor hesitated, then added what would have been unthinkable months earlier. I'm learning that complete self-sufficiency is perhaps an unrealistic goal out here. Something like approval flickered in Taylor's eyes as he wrote, "Cooperation keeps people alive. Independence means knowing when to seek help." The distinction struck Eleanor as profound, a more nuanced understanding of frontier life than the simple self-reliance she had initially imagined. True strength came not from rejecting assistance, but from building networks of mutual support that benefited everyone. Together, they unloaded the firewood, stacking it efficiently in her woodshed. The work was grueling in the bitter cold, but the physical activity generated welcome warmth. When they finished, Eleanor insisted Taylor come inside to warm himself before the return journey. The contrast between the frigid outdoors and the cabin's relative warmth was stark. Taylor stood before the fire, his normally weathered face reddened by cold and exertion. Eleanor busied herself preparing coffee, grateful for the domestic routine that gave her something to do besides watch her visitor. "Thor, how are conditions in town?" she asked, handing him a steaming mug. "Roads are barely passable. Stage hasn't run in 8 days. Telegraph down." This news was concerning. Silverton Pass was effectively cut off from the broader world, dependent entirely on its own resources until conditions improved. "Are people managing? Is there enough food, medicine?" Taylor's expression grew more serious. Most prepared adequately. Some did not. Town council rationing supplies at the general store. Those who prepared subsidizing those who didn't. Eleanor observed. He nodded, sipping his coffee, then wrote, "Nature doesn't recognize good intentions, only actions." The blunt assessment was characteristic of Taylor, no judgment, simply acknowledgement of reality. In this harsh environment, foresight and preparation weren't virtues, but necessities. Those who failed to prepare faced consequences that no amount of goodwill from others could fully mitigate. "Will there be enough to last if the weather continues like this?" Eleanor asked. Taylor hesitated, then wrote honestly, "Uncertain. Not seen winter this severe this early since '68. The implications hung in the air between them. If conditions worsened or even maintained their current severity, genuine hardship might follow, even for those who had prepared as best they could. "Is there anything I should be doing that I haven't thought of?" Eleanor asked. Practical concerns. Overriding potential pride. Taylor considered, then wrote, "Conserve lamp oil. Daylight hours are getting shorter. Read by firelight when possible. Melt snow for washing. Save well water for drinking and cooking. Keep extra blankets ready in case fire goes out overnight." All sensible precautions that reflected his years of experience with frontier winters. Eleanor nodded, mentally adding these items to her daily routine. As Taylor prepared to leave, he paused at the door, seeming to debate with himself. Finally, he wrote, "If conditions worsen, might need to relocate temporarily." "Relocate? To town, you mean?" He shook his head. "To my cabin, smaller space, easier to heat, better constructed." The suggestion, practical on its face, carried implications. That would have been scandalous in Boston society. A single woman taking shelter in a bachelor's home, however necessary for survival, would generate gossip that could permanently damage her reputation. But they weren't in Boston. And Eleanor had long since recognized that frontier survival demanded flexibility in social conventions. Still, she appreciated that Taylor had framed it as a contingency rather than an immediate necessity. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," she said. "But thank you for thinking ahead." He nodded once, then mounted his horse and headed back toward his own cabin, the empty sled trailing behind him through the snow. The following week brought no improvement in the weather. If anything, conditions worsened, as another storm deposited an additional foot of snow across the valley. Eleanor maintained her routine, tending the fire, melting snow for washing, reading by firelight to conserve lamp oil, and venturing outside only when absolutely necessary. She hadn't seen Taylor for 3 days when a pounding at her door roused her from sleep well before dawn on the 4th morning. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she opened the door to find him standing. There, his expression more urgent than she had ever seen it. "What's happened?" she asked, instantly alert despite the early hour. He wrote quickly, the strokes of his chalk more hurried than usual. "Fire at Lockhart Ranch. Daniel was injured. Sarah sent for help. How badly injured? Burns, broken leg. Need medical attention. Must get him to the town doctor." "What can I do?" "Prepare a cabin. He can't travel all the way to town in this condition. Need a safe place between." Eleanor understood immediately. The Harrison property sat roughly halfway between the Lockhart Ranch and Silverton Pass. Bringing the injured man here would allow him to rest before attempting the final journey to town and the doctor's care. "I'll get everything ready," she said, already mentally reorganizing her space. "How long before you arrive with him?" 2 hours, if all goes well. We'll bring Sarah, too. I'll be prepared." Taylor disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Eleanor to transform her small cabin into a temporary hospital. She built up the fire to maximum heat, rearranged her furniture to accommodate a makeshift bed near the warmth, and set water to boil for both drinking and potential wound cleaning. From her trunk, she retrieved clean linens that could serve as bandages if needed. Her small supply of medicinal items, witch hazel, camphor, and a bottle of whiskey kept for emergencies, were placed within easy reach. The sun was barely above the horizon when she heard the approach of horses. Looking outside, she saw Taylor leading a sled across the snow. On it lay Daniel Lockhart, wrapped in blankets, with Sarah sitting beside him, her face drawn with worry. Eleanor rushed outside to help. "Bring him in by the fire," she directed. "I prepared a place for him." Between them, Taylor and Eleanor carried the injured man inside, while Sarah followed with additional supplies. Daniel was semi-conscious, his breathing labored, one leg splinted with pieces of wood bound together with rope. Angry red burns marked one side of his face and his right hand. "The barn caught fire," Sarah explained, as they settled Daniel on the makeshift bed. "We think a lantern was knocked over. Daniel went in to save the horses, got them out, but the roof beam came down on him." Taylor examined the splint, then wrote, "Set leg properly. Burns need cleaning. They work together with the efficiency of people united by urgent purpose." Eleanor cleaned the burns with boiled water and witch hazel, while Taylor adjusted the splint to better immobilize the broken bone. Sarah, despite her obvious exhaustion, maintained a steady stream of reassuring words to her semi-conscious husband. By mid-morning, they had done all they could. Daniel rested as comfortably as his injuries allowed, his burns cleaned and wrapped, his leg properly set and elevated. "We need to get him to Dr. Wilson in town," Sarah said, gently stroking her husband's grey hair. "These burns need proper medical attention, and I'm worried about a fever setting in." Taylor nodded, then wrote, "Rest here today. Leave for town at first light tomorrow." Better traveling in daylight. The logic was undeniable, though Eleanor could see Sarah's reluctance to delay treatment. "We'll watch him carefully," she assured the older woman. "Any sign of fever or worsening condition, and we'll set out immediately, regardless of the hour." Sarah nodded gratefully, the strain of the night's events evident in the lines of her face. "You're both very kind. I don't know how we would have managed without you. Neighbors help neighbors," Taylor wrote simply, echoing Sarah's own words from their earlier meeting. As the day progressed, Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he was coherent enough to take sips of water and whiskey for the pain, but too weak for extended conversation. Sarah rarely left his side, her concern evident in every gentle touch and murmured encouragement. Eleanor maintained the fire at a steady heat and prepared simple food. Broth for Daniel, heartier. Stew for the rest of them. Taylor made several trips outside, checking on the horses, bringing in more firewood, and assessing weather conditions for the journey ahead. By evening, it was clear that Daniel's condition had stabilized. His breathing was more regular, and no fever had developed, encouraging signs given the circumstances. Sarah finally allowed herself to doze in the chair beside him, her hand still resting protectively on his arm. Eleanor stepped outside for a moment of quiet, finding Taylor standing by the corral, looking toward the mountains, now shadowy in the fading light. She joined him, pulling her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Do you think he'll be all right?" she asked softly. Taylor turned, his expression thoughtful as he reached for his slate. "Strong man, good constitution. If infection doesn't set in, should recover. Sarah mentioned they've been married for 30 years. I can't imagine the fear she must be feeling. Found each other during the California gold rush. Been through worse together. This glimpse into the Lockhart's history surprised Eleanor. You know them well, it seems." Taylor hesitated, then wrote, "Daniel gave me a job when others wouldn't. Ex-soldier. Silent. Didn't ask questions about war." The admission revealed yet another layer of Taylor's past. Not just his silence, but the difficulty he had faced integrating back into civilian society as a man who chose not to speak. Daniel Lockhart's acceptance had clearly meant a great deal to him. "They're fortunate to have your loyalty," Eleanor said. Taylor shook his head slightly. "Loyalty goes both ways." The simple statement highlighted what Eleanor was coming to recognize as a core truth of frontier life, the interdependence that sustained people through hardships no individual could weather alone. What from a distance might look like rugged independence was actually a carefully balanced network of mutual obligation and assistance. They returned to the cabin to find Daniel awake and Sarah feeding him small spoonfuls of broth. The older man's eyes, though pained, were alert and aware of his surroundings. "Miss Shaw," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Sarah tells me you've turned your cabin into a hospital for a stranger. That's frontier hospitality at its finest." "Hardly. Strangers," Eleanor replied with a smile. "Not after Mrs. Lockhart's apple pie and good advice." A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's burned face. "Ah, so she's been dispensing wisdom along with dessert. That sounds like my Sarah." Taylor approached the makeshift bed, his expression questioning. Daniel understood immediately. "I'll be ready to travel by morning, James. Lockhart men are hard to kill. Just ask the mining claim jumpers of 49. Sarah rolled her eyes fondly at her husband's bravado. "What he means is that he's too stubborn to let a broken leg and a few burns keep him down." The easy affection between them after 30 years of marriage struck Eleanor forcefully. They had built not just a ranch, but a genuine partnership that had weathered decades of frontier challenges. It offered a glimpse of what enduring connection might look like in this harsh but beautiful country. With Daniel resting comfortably, they worked out a plan for the morning journey. Taylor would construct a more comfortable sled for transporting the injured man. Eleanor would prepare food and extra blankets for the trip. Sarah would remain with Daniel, monitoring his condition through the night. "You should get some rest," Eleanor told Sarah. "I can sit with him for a few hours." The older woman hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her husband's side. "Sarah," Daniel said gently, "let Miss Shaw spell you for a bit. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Finally persuaded, Sarah settled on Eleanor's cot for a few hours of much-needed sleep, while Eleanor took her place beside Daniel. "James Taylor thinks highly of you," Daniel said quietly when they were alone. "I can tell." Eleanor felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "He's been very kind, teaching me what I need to know to survive here." Kind. isn't a word most would associate with James. Capable, certainly. Reliable without question. But he keeps himself apart from most folks. Daniel's eyes, shrewd despite his injuries, studied her. Interesting that he's made an exception in your case. Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond to this observation, which touched on feelings she herself hadn't fully examined. We're neighbors, and I suspect he felt responsible when he found me at the burned house, believing in a man who didn't exist. Daniel nodded slightly. Sarah told me about that deception. Shameful business, luring a woman across the country with false promises. He paused, then added, though perhaps not entirely unfortunate in the end. No, Eleanor agreed softly. Not entirely unfortunate. Outside, she could hear Taylor working by lantern light, constructing the sled that would carry Daniel to town. The rhythmic sounds of sawing and hammering provided a comforting backdrop to the quiet cabin. Life rarely gives us what we expect, Daniel mused, his voice growing sleepy from the combination of pain, exhaustion, and whiskey. Sometimes it's worse. Sometimes, if we're very fortunate, it's better in ways we couldn't have imagined. The philosophy offered through lips tight with pain resonated deeply with Eleanor's own journey. She had come west expecting one life and found something entirely different. The deception that had brought her here had ultimately opened a door to experiences and connections that would have remained forever closed had William Grant been real. As Daniel drifted back to sleep, Eleanor found herself contemplating the strange path that had led her to this moment, sitting in a frontier cabin tending to an injured neighbor while outside. A man who communicated without words worked through the night to ensure safe passage for tomorrow's journey. None of it resembled the future she had envisioned when boarding the stagecoach in Boston, yet she couldn't honestly wish to change a single step of the journey. Dawn brought clearing skies and marginally warmer temperatures, favorable conditions for the journey to town. Taylor had completed the transport sled, a surprisingly sophisticated construction with runners designed to glide smoothly over snow and a raised platform to keep Daniel elevated above the cold ground. They moved the injured man as gently as possible, securing him with blankets and ropes to prevent shifting during travel. Sarah took her place beside her husband, prepared to monitor his condition throughout the journey. "I can't thank you enough," she told Eleanor, as Taylor finished hitching his strongest horse to the sled. "You've been a godsend to us." "I've done nothing you wouldn't have done for me," Eleanor replied honestly. "Safe journey. Please send word when you've seen the doctor. We'll deliver them to town, then return," Taylor wrote before mounting his horse. "Should be back by nightfall." Eleanor nodded, understanding his unwritten message. He wanted her to know she wouldn't be alone for long, in the aftermath of the emergency. "I'll keep the fire going." She stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching until the sled and riders disappeared around a bend in the snow-covered track. The morning sun cast long blue shadows across the pristine snow, and for a moment the beauty of the scene made Eleanor forget the danger and hardship that had precipitated it. Then she turned back to her cabin, now bearing the evidence of its overnight transformation into an emergency shelter, furniture rearranged, bedding soiled with blood and soot, dishes stacked from feeding unexpected guests. The work of restoration would keep her busy until Taylor's return, a welcome distraction from the worry that lingered after seeing Daniel's painful journey begin. As she straightened her small domain, Eleanor reflected on how quickly crisis had forged deeper connections between herself and her neighbors. The Lockharts were no longer merely acquaintances, but people whose pain and courage she had witnessed firsthand. And Taylor, the enigmatic silent man who had initially been simply a provider of necessary knowledge, had revealed himself through action as someone of extraordinary character and commitment. These bonds, created through shared adversity rather than social convention, felt more genuine than any she had known in Boston. They were based not on family background or financial status, but on the more essential qualities of character, capability, and willingness to help when needed. By the time Taylor returned at dusk, Eleanor had restored her cabin to order and prepared a simple but hearty meal in anticipation of his arrival. She had also made a decision about something that had been building in her mind since the Lockharts had departed that morning. As Taylor warmed himself by the fire, she placed a bowl of stew before him, then seated herself across the small table. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you mentioned before, the possibility of needing to relocate if conditions worsen." She met his gaze directly. "I'd like to learn more about that option, not as an emergency measure, but as a practical consideration while the worst of winter passes." Taylor studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for his slate. "Concerns about propriety are reasonable. Small community notices everything. I'm more concerned with survival than gossip," Eleanor replied firmly. "And I suspect Silverton Pass has more pressing matters to discuss this winter than my living arrangements." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he wrote, "Cabin is small, basic, but solid construction, room for two if necessary." "Then consider it decided," Eleanor said with a certainty that surprised even her. "The next severe storm, I'll relocate, temporarily to conserve resources and ensure safety." She hesitated, then added, "That is, if the offer still stands." Taylor nodded once, the simple gesture somehow conveying both acceptance and respect for her practical decision. There was no hint of impropriety in his manner, only the mutual recognition that survival sometimes required adjusting social expectations to meet the demands of an unforgiving environment. As they shared the meal in comfortable silence, Eleanor reflected that such an arrangement would have been unthinkable mere months ago. Yet now it seemed not only reasonable, but right. Another step in her evolution from Boston schoolteacher to frontier woman capable of making decisions based on reality rather than convention. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly as night deepened. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and shared purpose, Eleanor felt a security that had nothing to do with walls and everything to do with the human connection that had unexpectedly become the foundation of her new life. January arrived with a ferocity that tested even the most prepared residents of Silverton Pass. A blizzard raged for 3 consecutive days, the wind howling like a living creature as it drove snow into drifts reaching the cabin eaves. When the storm finally passed, the temperature plummeted to levels Eleanor had never imagined possible, transforming the world into a brittle, crystalline landscape where the simple act of breathing outdoors caused pain as the frigid air seared lungs. On the 5th day of this brutal cold snap, Eleanor made the decision they had discussed weeks earlier. After carefully banking her fire and securing the cabin, she packed essential belongings into saddlebags and prepared Daisy for the journey. To Taylor's property, the ride, though less than 2 miles, demanded every bit of the horsemanship Taylor had taught her. The bitter cold numbed her despite multiple layers of clothing, and Daisy struggled through snow that sometimes reached the horse's chest in deeper drifts. By the time Taylor's cabin came into view, Eleanor's face was so cold she could barely feel it, and her gloved hands had lost most sensation. Taylor must have been watching for her, for he emerged from his cabin the moment she appeared on the ridge, hurrying to help her dismount from Daisy with hands that felt remarkably warm against her chilled body. Inside, quickly, he wrote on his slate, his expression concerned as he noted her pallor and the slight disorientation that came from prolonged exposure to extreme cold. The interior of Taylor's cabin provided an immediate contrast to the killing temperatures outside. A substantial fireplace dominated one wall, radiating heat throughout the single room. Everything about the space spoke of careful design and practical efficiency. The bed built into an alcove to conserve heat, shelves and hooks arranged to maximize storage in minimal space, windows positioned to capture maximum light while minimizing heat loss. "It's wonderful," Eleanor managed, through lips still stiff with cold, standing before the fire with outstretched hands. "So much warmer than my cabin." Taylor nodded, hanging her snow-covered outer garments near the door, then moving to tend to Daisy, ensuring the mare was properly sheltered in his small but well-built stable. By the time he returned, Eleanor had begun to thaw properly, sensation returning to her extremities with the painful tingling that accompanied rewarming. She'd had enough experience with the cold now to recognize this as normal rather than dangerous, unlike the deceptive comfort that preceded true frostbite. Taylor immediately set water to boil, then reached for his slate. Tea helps restore warmth from inside, made from local herbs. The tea, when served, had an unfamiliar but pleasant flavor, slightly minty, with undertones of something like pine. Its warming effect seemed to reach her core more quickly than any beverage Eleanor had tried previously. "This is remarkable," she said, cradling the mug between still, tender hands. "Your own blend." He nodded, then elaborated. "Learned from Ute medicine woman years ago. Good for cold, helps prevent mountain sickness too." This casual reference to learning from native peoples was another reminder of how fundamentally different Taylor's experiences had been from her own sheltered upbringing. He had clearly absorbed knowledge from every available source, regardless of society's typical hierarchies or prejudices. As the day progressed, they established a rhythm of shared habitation that felt surprisingly natural. Taylor showed her the cabin's features, where he stored food, how he regulated the fireplace for maximum efficiency, which shelves held which supplies. In turn, Eleanor organized her belongings in the small space he had cleared for her use, careful to minimize her presence in his meticulously arranged domain. By evening, the practical arrangements were complete, leaving them to navigate the less tangible aspects of their temporary cohabitation. Eleanor was acutely aware that despite the frontier's more flexible social standards, they were engaged in something that would raise eyebrows even in Silverton Pass, an unmarried woman sharing quarters with a bachelor, regardless of the circumstances. Taylor seemed to sense her thoughts, for he reached for his slate. "You take bed. I'll use bedroll by fire." "I couldn't possibly displace you from your own bed," Eleanor protested. "The bedroll is perfectly adequate for me." He shook his head firmly. "Hospitality has rules. Guest gets best accommodations." The simple statement, delivered with such certainty, made Eleanor smile, despite her discomfort with the situation. "You are remarkably stubborn, Mr. Taylor." Something like amusement flickered in his eyes as he wrote, "James." After sharing cabin, formality seems excessive. The shift to first names, a significant boundary crossed, acknowledged the unusual intimacy of their arrangement, while establishing a new framework of mutual respect to govern it. "James," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "And I'm Eleanor, not Miss Shaw." He nodded once, accepting the exchange as settled, then turned to preparing their evening meal, a stew that had been simmering slowly throughout the afternoon, filling the cabin with savory aromas that reminded Eleanor how long it had been since her meager breakfast. That first night established the pattern for the days that followed. James took the bedroll near the fire, despite Eleanor's continued protests, rising before dawn to rebuild the fire and start coffee before she awoke. They shared meals at the small table, dividing household tasks according to ability rather than conventional gender roles. Eleanor found herself learning new skills daily: how to maintain the perfect fireplace temperature, how to mend leather harnesses, how to preserve meat in the frontier fashion. The forced proximity, which might have been awkward or tension-filled, instead developed into a comfortable routine. James remained a man of few written words, but his actions spoke volumes about his character. He was unfailingly considerate, scrupulously respectful of her privacy, and seemingly untroubled by arrangements that defied social convention. For her part, Eleanor discovered that the Boston schoolteacher, who had been so concerned with propriety and reputation, now found those considerations increasingly irrelevant compared to more fundamental values: kindness, competence, integrity. James Taylor possessed these qualities in abundance, making him, in her estimation, more truly civilized than many supposedly cultured men she had known in the East. A week into this arrangement, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Eleanor found herself contemplating how profoundly her perspective had shifted since arriving in Colorado Territory. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach seeking a husband to provide security would now find that version of herself almost unrecognizable. "I was thinking," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about how different my expectations were when I first arrived." James looked up from the bridle he was repairing, his expression curious. "I thought I was coming to a comfortable ranch house, to a man who would essentially rescue me from having to make my own decisions." She smiled ruefully. "I imagined a much more conventional life than the one I've found." He reached for his slate. "Regrets? None," Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Which surprises me perhaps more than it would surprise anyone else. I came seeking security but found something I didn't know I needed: the chance to discover my own capability." James considered. "This then wrote, 'Some find freedom frightening. You embraced it.'" "Not immediately," she admitted. "That first night in the cabin alone, I was terrified. But each small success built confidence for the next challenge. Like building a fire," he wrote. "Each log placed correctly makes the whole structure stronger." The metaphor was perfectly suited to a blacksmith: practical, elemental, focused on process rather than theory. It was also, Eleanor realized, precisely how their relationship had developed, not through grand gestures or declarations, but through accumulated moments of trust and mutual support. The moment of reflection was interrupted by a sound rarely heard in the depths of winter: hoofbeats approaching through the snow. James rose immediately, moving to the window with the alertness of someone for whom unexpected visitors were a cause for caution rather than celebration. His posture relaxed slightly as he recognized the rider, and he opened the door to admit Sheriff Thomas Holbrook, snow-covered and visibly exhausted from fighting the brutal conditions. "Taylor," the sheriff nodded in greeting, then noticed Eleanor by the fire. His eyebrows rose slightly, but to his credit, he made no comment on finding her in James's cabin. "Miss Shaw, glad to see you're both well." Sheriff Holbrook, Eleanor, acknowledged, rising to offer him coffee. "You look half frozen. What brings you out in these conditions?" Holbrook accepted the coffee gratefully, gulping it despite its temperature. "Trouble brewing in town. Thought you should know, especially since it might concern you, Miss Shaw." Eleanor exchanged a glance with James, whose expression had grown watchful. "What kind of trouble?" "Stranger arrived on yesterday's stage from Denver," Holbrook explained, warming his hands around the mug. "Well-dressed Eastern fellow, asking questions about a woman from Boston, showed your description to half the businesses in town before I got wind of it." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran through Eleanor. "Did he give his name? Called himself Howard Mercer? Said he was representing family interests?" The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Howard Mercer, her father's business associate, the man whose unwanted attentions she had fled. Somehow he had traced her to Silverton Pass, just as she had feared he might. James watched her reaction closely, then wrote, "Someone you know?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice strained. "The man I mentioned before." the one who expected to acquire my father's business through marriage to me. I never thought he would actually follow me west." Holbrook's expression grew more concerned. "He's staying at the Mountain View Inn, asking everyone about a Miss Eleanor Shaw, who might have arrived last summer. Says he's worried about your welfare, but something about him didn't sit right with me. That's why I rode out to warn you." "Thank you, Sheriff. Your instincts are correct. Mr. Mercer's concern is entirely self-serving." Eleanor struggled to maintain her composure as she contemplated the implications of Howard's arrival. "Did you tell him where to find me?" "Told him I'd make inquiries," Holbrook said. "Didn't mention the Harrison property or Taylor here. Figured that was your business to share or not." James had been listening intently, his expression darkening as he understood the situation. He wrote quickly, "What does he want?" Eleanor sighed, recognizing that full disclosure was necessary. "My father owned a successful textile business in Boston. Before his death, he transferred ownership to me rather than to Howard, who had expected to gain control through a marriage arranged with my father. When I left Boston, I also left instructions with our family lawyer regarding management of the business." She looked at James directly. "What Howard doesn't know, what almost no one knows, is that I also withdrew a substantial portion of the company's liquid assets before departing. The money I've been living on isn't just personal savings. It's the business capital that Howard believes rightfully belongs under his control." The admission hung in the air between them. Eleanor waited for judgment, for criticism of what could be seen as deception by omission in their relationship. Instead, James simply nodded, his expression unchanged as he wrote, "Your father gave it to you legally." "Yes. Everything was properly documented and filed with the courts. Then it's yours to use as you see fit." The simple acceptance, free of the moral censure she had half expected, reinforced Eleanor's growing certainty that James Taylor was unlike any man she had previously known. He judged situations on their fundamental fairness rather than by arbitrary social standards. Holbrook cleared his throat. "Well, legal or not, this Mercer fellow seems determined to find you. What do you want me to tell him if he keeps asking around?" Eleanor considered her options. Running again wasn't feasible, not in winter, and not when she had finally begun establishing a life that felt genuinely her own. Hiding was similarly impractical in a community as small as Silverton Pass. "Tell him the truth," she decided finally, "that I'm living at the Harrison property, but perhaps not immediately. I'd like a day to prepare for his arrival." The sheriff nodded. "I can stall him that long easily enough. Roads are bad anyway. He couldn't reach the Harrison place until tomorrow at the earliest." James wrote, "We'll return to your cabin at first light. Better to meet him there." Eleanor understood the logic. Facing Howard at her own property rather than James's cabin would demonstrate independence rather than vulnerability, and avoid the complications of being found in living arrangements that Howard would certainly use against her if possible. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "We appreciate the warning." After Holbrook departed, having refused offers to stay the night in favor of returning to his duties in town, Eleanor found herself gripped by an anxiety she hadn't felt since her early days. In Colorado Territory, the life she had carefully constructed seemed suddenly threatened by this unwelcome connection to her past. James watched her pacing before the fire, then wrote, "Tell me about him. Need to understand what we're facing." The use of "we" rather than "you" wasn't lost on Eleanor. Even without discussion, James had positioned himself as her ally in the coming confrontation. "Howard Mercer is everything that succeeds in Boston society," she explained. "Charming, well-connected, from an old family with a distinguished name but diminished finances. My father believed his business acumen would help expand our company, and Howard cultivated that belief carefully." She paused, organizing her thoughts, but a man she had hoped never to encounter again. What my father didn't see, or chose not to see, was Howard's less admirable qualities. His cruelty to those he considers beneath him, his belief that women are essentially property to be acquired and controlled, his willingness to manipulate others to achieve his aims. James considered this assessment, then wrote, "Dangerous? Not physically, I don't think. His methods are more subtle. Social pressure, legal maneuvering, attacking reputation rather than person." Eleanor's hands twisted together unconsciously. "But he's persistent and resourceful. He wouldn't have come this far without a plan." "You've changed since Boston," James wrote. "He expects the woman who left, not the woman you've become." The observation struck Eleanor forcefully. Howard would indeed be expecting the somewhat sheltered, socially conscious woman who had fled Boston, not the self-reliant, practical person who had survived months of frontier challenges. Perhaps that difference provided an advantage she hadn't considered. "You're right," she said slowly. "He'll try to use my former weaknesses against me: concern for social standing, desire for security, lack of practical knowledge. None of those apply anymore." James nodded, a rare smile briefly transforming his serious features. "Use that. Show strength, not vulnerability." As they prepared for sleep, making plans for the early return to the Harrison property, Eleanor found her anxiety gradually replaced by a steely determination. Howard Mercer represented everything she had left behind: a world of rigid social hierarchies, prescribed roles for women, and marriages based on financial arrangements rather than genuine connection. Facing him would be the ultimate test of her transformation from Boston society woman to Colorado frontierswoman. It would require not just the practical skills she had acquired, but a fundamental shift in how she valued herself and her choices. In the darkness, listening to the soft sounds of James sleeping near the fire, Eleanor felt a clarity she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Whatever Howard intended, whatever legal or social pressure he might bring to bear, she would not surrender the independence she had fought so hard to establish. The woman who had arrived seeking a husband now stood prepared to defend her right to determine her own future, with or without one. Dawn brought preparation for the confrontation ahead. James insisted on riding with Eleanor to the Harrison property, his protective instincts evident, though he made no attempt to take control of the situation. They arrived to find the cabin cold and undisturbed, allowing several hours to build up the fire, prepare food, and create the setting for Howard's inevitable appearance. As midday approached, James wrote, "We'll stay, unless you prefer to face him alone." "I'd like you to stay," Eleanor admitted, "not because I need protection, but because I value your presence." He nodded, understanding the distinction. This wasn't about a man defending a woman, but about allies facing a challenge together, each contributing their particular strengths. The sound of an approaching sleigh came shortly after noon. Through the window, Eleanor could see a hired conveyance from town, with a figure muffled in expensive furs seated behind the driver. Even at a distance, Howard Mercer's bearing conveyed the entitled confidence of someone accustomed to deference. "He's here," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. "Remember, whatever he claims about me or my past, trust that I'll explain everything fully once he's gone." James met her gaze directly, his blue eyes conveying what his silent voice could not: absolute faith in her integrity, regardless of what accusations might be forthcoming. As the sleigh drew to a stop before the cabin, Eleanor squared her shoulders and opened the door, prepared to confront not just Howard Mercer, but the final vestiges of the woman she had once been. Howard Mercer cut an impressive figure as he stepped from the hired sleigh. Tall, impeccably dressed in a fur-lined coat that had clearly never seen actual labor, with a face that combined aristocratic features and the confident smile of a man accustomed to getting his way. His dark hair, carefully styled beneath an expensive hat, showed no trace of grey despite his 40 years, and his clean-shaven appearance stood in stark contrast to the bearded men typical of frontier settlements. "Eleanor," he called, approaching the cabin with an outstretched hand. "Thank God I've found you. You can't imagine my concern when I discovered you'd departed Boston without a word." Eleanor remained in the doorway, making no move to meet his offered hand. "That's not entirely accurate, Howard. I left specific instructions with Mr. Phillips regarding the management of Thornton Textiles in my absence." Howard's smile faltered slightly at her cool reception, but he recovered quickly. "Ah, yes, the lawyer. He was unfortunately not forthcoming about your whereabouts. I've been searching for months." His gaze shifted past her to where James stood silently inside the cabin. "You see, you're not alone. Won't you introduce me to your friend?" The slight pause before friend carried unmistakable insinuation. Eleanor refused to rise to the bait. "James Taylor, this is Howard Mercer from Boston. Mr. Mercer, Mr. Taylor is the foreman of this property and a valued neighbor." Howard extended his hand to James, who hesitated briefly before accepting it with a firm grip that caused the Bostonian to wince slightly. "A pleasure, I'm sure," Howard said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I hope you won't mind if I speak. Privately with Miss Shaw, we have urgent business matters to discuss." James looked to Eleanor, clearly leaving the decision to her. "Mr. Taylor is aware of my circumstances," she said. "Anything you wish to say can be said in his presence." Howard's expression hardened, the charming facade slipping momentarily to reveal the calculation beneath. "As you wish, though I must say I'm surprised at how rustic your living conditions have become. This is hardly the environment Jonathan envisioned for his daughter." "My father wanted me to have freedom and independence above all," Eleanor countered. "Please come inside, Howard. The temperature is dropping, and I doubt your Boston attire is adequate for extended exposure to Colorado winters." Once inside, Howard made a show of examining the cabin's simple furnishings, his distaste evident despite his attempt at a neutral expression. "Quite a change from Commonwealth Avenue," he remarked, removing his gloves. "I can't imagine what drove you to such primitive circumstances." "I think you know exactly what, or rather who, drove me to seek a new beginning," Eleanor replied, her gaze steady. "But that's irrelevant now. What matters is why you've traveled so far to find me." Howard adopted an expression of wounded concern. "Out of worry for your welfare, of course. When you disappeared so abruptly, leaving only the most minimal instructions regarding the business, I feared you might have fallen victim to some scheme or manipulation." "The only scheme I encountered was upon arrival," Eleanor said, "when I discovered the man I'd corresponded with didn't exist. Everything since then has been my choice." Howard raised an eyebrow. "A mail-order bride arrangement? Really, Eleanor, I would never have expected such desperation from a woman of your background and education." James shifted position slightly, his stance becoming more protective, though his expression remained impassive. Eleanor appreciated his restraint. Responding to Howard's provocations would only feed into the narrative the Bostonian was attempting to create. "My personal decisions are not the issue here," she said firmly. "You've traveled a considerable distance, presumably with some purpose beyond expressing concern for my choices." Howard sighed dramatically, seating himself uninvited in the cabin's single comfortable chair. "Always direct to business. Your father would be proud." He glanced meaningfully around the cabin. "Though perhaps not of all your recent decisions." "State your purpose, Howard." "Very well." His tone shifted, becoming more formal. "As the designated business partner of the late Jonathan Thornton, I've come to inform you that your extended absence has created serious complications for Thornton Textiles. The board of directors has expressed grave concerns about absentee ownership, particularly given the substantial funds that were withdrawn immediately prior to your departure. Eleanor had anticipated this approach. The funds were legally mine to withdraw, as confirmed by the company charter and my father's will. As for absentee ownership, Mr. Phillips has been executing my instructions admirably, according to the quarterly reports I've received. Howard's surprise at learning she had maintained contact with the company's operations was evident. Reports that failed to address the fundamental issue. Thornton Textiles requires active leadership from someone with intimate knowledge of the textile industry and Boston's business community. The company is suffering without proper direction. Is it? Eleanor moved to a small trunk in the corner, retrieving a folder of papers. The most recent financial statements show a 12% increase in profits compared to the same quarter last year. Hardly the performance of a suffering enterprise. James watched the exchange with keen attention, his eyes moving between Eleanor and Howard like a chess player analyzing opposing strategies. Though silent, his presence seemed to unnerve Howard, who kept glancing in his direction with poorly concealed irritation. Temporary results that don't reflect longer-term challenges, Howard insisted. The truth is, Eleanor, your father built Thornton Textiles with the understanding that I would eventually assume leadership, bringing my connections and experience to expand the company's reach. Your interpretation of his final wishes has disrupted plans years in the making. My father's documented legal decisions supersede any unwritten understanding you believe existed, Eleanor replied. The transfer of ownership was properly executed and witnessed while he was of sound mind. If he had intended for you to lead the company, he had ample opportunity to formalize such an arrangement. Howard's facade of concerned friend slipped further, revealing the frustration beneath. This stubbornness serves no one's interests, least of all your own. You're living in a primitive cabin in the wilderness, for God's sake, while one of Boston's most promising enterprises languishes without proper direction. The enterprise is thriving, according to every measurable standard, Eleanor countered. As for my living situation, it's temporary. The main house will be rebuilt come spring. This information seemed to catch Howard off guard. Rebuilt? You intend to stay in this godforsaken territory? I do. Eleanor's voice carried absolute certainty. I've purchased the Harrison property and have plans for its development that go well beyond mere survival. Howard glanced at James again, calculation evident in his expression. I see. And your friendship with the local population has influenced this decision? The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt a flash of anger at his attempt to reduce her life-changing journey to something as trivial as romantic entanglement. Before she could respond, James reached for his slate and wrote in bold, clear letters. Eleanor's decisions were made independently. My presence is irrelevant to her ownership rights. Howard stared at the slate, momentarily nonplussed by this. A form of communication. You don't speak? He asked, his tone somewhere between confusion and disdain. James simply tapped the slate, directing Howard's attention back to the written message. Mr. Taylor chooses not to speak, Eleanor explained. A decision made after his service in the war. His intellect and character, however, are beyond question. Howard recovered quickly, shifting tactics. How unusual. Well, regardless of local attachments, Eleanor, your place is in Boston. The business needs you, society expects you, and, frankly, your father would be appalled to see his only daughter living in such circumstances, associating with— He paused, glancing at James. Individuals of such unconventional nature, Eleanor felt, rather than saw, James stiffen beside her. My father valued integrity and independence above social convention, Howard, something you never truly understood about him. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. Now let me be perfectly clear. I have no intention of returning to Boston. Not now, not in the spring, not ever. Thornton Textiles will continue under my ownership with management executed according to my directions. Howard's charming mask dropped completely, revealing the cold ambition beneath. This is madness, Eleanor. You're throwing away everything your father built, everything you were raised to value. For what? A burned-out homestead and the company of a mute ranch hand. The deliberate cruelty of the comment hung in the air. Eleanor glanced at James, expecting to see offense at Howard's words, but found instead a calm assessment that suggested he was measuring the man's character rather than reacting to his insults. "I think you should leave now, Howard," Eleanor said quietly. "You've made your purpose clear, and I've given you my answer. There's nothing more to discuss." On the contrary, Howard stood, his expression hardening. "There's the matter of the funds you removed from company accounts before your departure. The board considers this an unauthorized withdrawal that must be returned immediately." "The board has no standing to make such demands," Eleanor replied. "As majority owner, I authorize the withdrawal myself, and the funds remain my property, to use as I see fit. This frontier existence has clearly affected your reasoning." Howard's voice took on a patronizing tone. "You need to return to civilization before you make decisions that permanently damage your future. I'm prepared to be generous, Eleanor. Come back to Boston, return the funds to the company accounts, and we can move forward as your father intended. With you as my wife and me as the business leader he always envisioned." The naked ambition of the proposal, framed as generosity but transparent in its self-interest, would have intimidated Eleanor, who had left Boston months earlier. But that woman no longer existed. "My father's intentions are documented in his will and the business transfer, not in your convenient interpretations," she said, her voice steady. "I will not return to Boston, I will not relinquish control of my inheritance, and I certainly will not marry you, Howard. Not now, not ever." For a moment fury twisted Howard's handsome features into something almost unrecognizable. Then, with visible effort, he regained his composure and reached for his coat. "You leave me no choice but to pursue legal remedies, Eleanor. Your extended absence, combined with these imprudent financial decisions, provides ample grounds for the court to appoint a conservator for both you and the business interests you're clearly mismanaging." James moved forward then, writing quickly on his slate and holding it where both Eleanor and Howard could read. "Any legal action would need territorial court approval. Judge Daniel Lockhart presides here, knows Eleanor's character and capability firsthand." Howard frowned at this unexpected complication. Local judicial peculiarities notwithstanding, Boston courts have primary jurisdiction over Thornton Textiles. "But not over me," Eleanor pointed out. "I've established legal residence in Colorado Territory, registered property ownership here, and have documented evidence of sound mental capacity and business judgment. Any attempt to declare me incompetent would face significant judicial hurdles, particularly given the company's continued profitability under my direction." The confidence with which she delivered this assessment, clearly not the reaction of a woman easily intimidated by legal threats, caused Howard to reassess his approach. "This is not what Jonathan would have wanted for you," he said, attempting to appeal to sentiment where threats had failed. "He valued the business, yes, but he also valued your place in society, your future security. Living alone in the wilderness, associating with," he glanced disparagingly at James, "people who can't even participate in normal conversation. This isn't the life he envisioned for his daughter." "My father wanted me to live with integrity and independence," Eleanor replied. "I'm doing exactly that, and I'm not alone. I have neighbors, community, purpose, more genuine connection than I ever found in Boston society." Howard's gaze moved between Eleanor and James, noting something in their posture, their mutual protectiveness, that suggested a bond deeper than mere neighborly assistance. "I see," he said coldly. Well, when this frontier infatuation has run its course, and you find yourself desperate to return to civilization, don't expect a warm welcome. Boston society has little patience for women who abandon their responsibilities. And proper place. Then I shall have to build a life without Boston society's approval, Eleanor replied, opening the cabin door in clear dismissal. Good day, Howard. Your sleigh driver must be getting cold. For a moment, Howard looked as if he might continue the argument, but something in Eleanor's resolute expression convinced him of its futility. With a curt nod, he strode to the waiting sleigh without a backward glance. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching until the sleigh disappeared around the bend in the snow-covered track. Only then did she allow her shoulders to relax, the tension of the confrontation releasing in a long, shaky breath. James moved to stand beside her, his expression questioning as he wrote, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, surprised to discover it was true. "Actually, I feel more certain than ever before. Seeing Howard, hearing his arguments, they had no power over me. None of it had the power it once did." They returned inside, where Eleanor stoked the fire, the familiar task helping to ground her after the emotionally charged encounter. James sat at the small table, watching her with an expression that suggested he was waiting for her to process the experience in her own time. Finally, she joined him, her thoughts collected. "I should have told you sooner about the full extent of my financial situation," she said. "It wasn't that I didn't trust you, but rather that I wanted to establish myself here based on who I am, not what I possess." James nodded, writing, "Understand." "Completely. Past shapes us but doesn't define us. Howard will likely pursue some legal action," Eleanor continued. "He's not one to admit defeat easily. But I believe my position is secure, particularly with Judge Lockhart's court having jurisdiction over my residence here. Will help however needed," James wrote. "Have some experience with legal complications." This offhand reference to yet another aspect of his life that remained largely unknown to her reminded Eleanor how much of James Taylor remained a mystery, despite the months they had spent in each other's company. "James," she said carefully, "you've been extraordinarily supportive throughout everything since my arrival. You've taught me, helped me, stood beside me through challenges that would have overwhelmed me alone. Yet I realize how little I truly know about your life before we met." He seemed to consider this observation, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. After a moment, he wrote, "Some stories are difficult to tell, even in writing. But you deserve to know." He reached for a fresh sheet of paper, the slate inadequate for what he needed to communicate, and began to write more than Eleanor had ever seen from him at one time. Was captain in the Union Army, Pennsylvania Volunteers, led men into battle at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, lost most of my company at Gettysburg, ordered a charge that sent them into Confederate artillery, survived myself through pure chance. After the war, couldn't reconcile surviving when better men died following my orders." He paused, seeming to gather himself before continuing. Voice worked fine physically, chose silence as penance, reminder, came west seeking isolation, found purpose instead at Harrison Ranch. Nathan Harrison hired me despite peculiarity, as he called it. Became a family of sorts. Eleanor read each word carefully, understanding the immense trust implied by this sharing of his most painful experiences. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "It helps me understand your choices better." James nodded, then added one more line. "Silence began as punishment, became comfort eventually, then habit. Now just part of who I am. And who you are is someone I've come to admire deeply," Eleanor said, the words emerging with an honesty that surprised even her. "Your silence has never hindered our understanding. Perhaps it even enhanced it. We've learned to communicate in ways that go beyond casual conversation." He studied her face for a long moment, then wrote, "Never expected to find someone who understood. Changes everything." The simple statement contained volumes of meaning, an acknowledgement that their relationship had evolved into something neither had anticipated when she first arrived at the burned Harrison property. "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly, "it does change everything." Outside, the winter sun was beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the snow. Inside the cabin, warmed by fire and shared understanding, two people who had begun their journey seeking solitude found themselves contemplating a future neither had expected. James wrote again, the words careful and deliberate. "Property needs rebuilding come spring. Main house, outbuildings, fences, more than one person can manage alone. Are you proposing a continued partnership?" Eleanor asked, her heart quickening despite her attempt at a practical tone. His smile, rare but transformative when it appeared, softened his weathered features as he wrote, "Partnership at minimum. More if welcome." The carefully phrased offer, respecting her independence while acknowledging the deeper connection between them, touched Eleanor profoundly. This was not Howard Mercer's presumptuous expectation of marriage as a business arrangement, but something far more genuine. A relationship built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and a deep understanding that transcended conventional communication. "More would be very welcome," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "I came west, seeking security through marriage to a stranger. I found something infinitely more valuable, the chance to discover my own strength, and a connection based on who I truly am, not what society expected me to be." James reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers in a gesture more eloquent than any written or spoken words could have been. His blue eyes, usually guarded, held a warmth and certainty that needed no translation. In that moment, with the last light of day gilding the snow-covered landscape outside, Eleanor Shaw recognized the full circle of her journey. The deception that had brought her west, painful as it had been, had ultimately led her not to the fictional William Grant's comfortable ranch, but to something far more authentic, a life built by her own hands, a love based on genuine understanding, and a future limited only by her own courage and vision. Spring would bring rebuilding of the Harrison main house, of the ranch operations, perhaps eventually of a school for Silverton Pass, but the foundation had already been established, stronger and more enduring than any building could be. Eleanor had traveled west, seeking a husband, and found herself instead. In doing so, she had also found James Taylor, a man whose chosen silence spoke more truth than all of Howard Mercer's eloquent manipulations. As darkness settled over the Colorado wilderness, Eleanor felt none of the fear that had plagued her first nights in the territory. Whatever challenges lay ahead, legal threats from Howard, the physical demands of reconstruction, the ongoing hardships of frontier life, she would face them with hard-won confidence and the steadfast support of the silent man whose actions had always spoken louder than words ever could. The mail-order bride who had arrived at a burned cabin had not only survived, but thrived. And the silent ranch hand who had first viewed her as an unexpected complication to his solitary existence had found in her a reason to build rather than merely endure. Together, they would create something neither had imagined possible when their paths first crossed, a future defined not by what they had lost or fled, but by what they had found in each other and in themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.